Hello, welcome to the final of 3 videos for my biology introduction. So this video will be on evolution. As I've said in the previous videos, it is very important that you watch these in the clarified order. This is the final video, so watch this one last. The first video is on cells, and the second video is on DNA. These concepts do build off of each other in the order that they are done, so that is why you should watch them in the specified order. So without any further ado, let's get started. So what is evolution? Evolution is defined as any change in the inheritable characteristics of biological populations or over successive generations. Got my tongue. These characteristics are the expression of genes passed from parent to offspring during reproduction. These can be anything from eye color to hair type, to skin color, to height, anything really that can be expressed through genes. Evolution occurs when one of the evolutionary processes, there are several, but for the purpose of this video, we will be going over natural selection and sexual selection, act on a variation. And evolution itself relies on the existence of genetic variation in a population. And that genetic variation has to affect an organism's physical characteristics, which is known as a phenotype. Now, you may have heard the terminology phenotype versus genotype. Phenotype refers to the genes themselves that are within the body, the alleles. The way to remember that, of course, genotype, gene, they sound very similar. Then phenotype, notice the PH, like physical. Phenotypes are physical. So that's the way to remember that. So before we start learning about the actual concepts of evolution, I think it's important that we start with the history of evolutionary thought. So there are, of course, a lot of time periods, and this has been a heavily studied topic for a very, very long time. But the two main ones that are the most significant, in my opinion, are pre-Darwinian and the Darwinian Revolution, because Charles Darwin had a huge effect on the study of evolution and genetics. So pre-Darwinian started out with scientists sought explanations of natural phenomena in terms of the physical laws that were the same for all visible things and did not require existence of any fixed natural categories or divine cosmic order. Now, this was good in theory. However, when practiced, it was very slow to take root in biological sciences, which caused a lot of problems, which shows a lot of the reason why the Darwinian Revolution is one called the Darwinian Revolution, but there's a lot of backing up for those words because it really sped up the studying of genetics. And the naturalists at this time, they began to speculate on the evolutionary changes of species over time, according to the natural laws. So they began to catch on. But the real big change happened in the Darwinian Revolution with Charles Darwin. This was the crucial break from the constant typological changes or types in biology, and it came with the theory of evolution through natural selection. This was, of course, formulated by Charles Darwin, which it is named after, and he formulated it in terms of variable populations. Now, he didn't use the term evolution for this. He actually used a phrase called descent with modification. And he also noted, which will be important later in this video, that population change led to a struggle for existence in species. So remember that. So one of the main concepts that you'll need to know is heredity. This is the passing of traits from parents to their offspring. It can be done through two main ways. It can be done sexually or asexually. Now, the main differences between asexual and sexual, if you notice, asexual means not sexual, which means that the parent simply clones itself, similar to how cells go through mitosis. The parents clone themselves for their offspring. This means that there is a lot less genetic variation in the coming generations. But in sexual reproduction, it means that two parents combine their genes and then they create offspring. This, of course, by default, has a lot more variation in the coming generations because it's creating new combinations of genes. And that by default will create more changes if there's new combinations rather than the same ones. So the cells and organisms acquire their genetic information from their parents, which you probably already know. But this variation between these individuals, while it can't be small, like the width of your fingernail could be inherited, These variations can accumulate, and they can cause species to evolve through what's called natural selection. Now, as I mentioned before, the study of evolution has been it's been a heavily researched topic, and heredity especially has been very heavily researched. So this has become the study of what's genetics. So there are three main sources of variation that we'll be going through in this video. It is mutation, sex and recombination, and gene flow. So mutation, you may have heard the word before. You may have heard it for science fiction movies or horror movies, but mutation can really just be any change in the sequence of a cell's genome. For example, blue eyes were initially a mutation. And essentially what a mutation means is it's any alteration of the product of a gene, or it can prevent it from happening. This was the case for blue eyes because blue eyes initially started as the mutation that the pigment within brown eyes did not show up. So this was a mutation that prevented the gene of brown eyes from happening. So that was how that started. And mutations can involve either a large section of the chromosome being duplicated or small parts of several genes being duplicated. So an easy way to think about this is either something big needs to happen or a lot of small things need to happen. So generally the same amount of stuff that needs to happen, but it can be either spread out or it can be done in the same place, essentially. Then there's sex and recombination. I'm sure you know what sex is, but recombination is when changes when changes occur, which alleles are paired with each other. Now, for example, let's say you have two alleles. These two are both for blue eyes, so these alleles would create a blue eye. These two are, one is for brown eyes and one is for blue eyes. Due to the fact that blue eyes are recessive, as I mentioned in my last video, it would mean that this eye would end up appearing brown. So in the case of recombination, it would mean that, for example, one of these blue alleles would switch with the brown allele, which would mean that this eye then becomes a brown eye allele and a blue eye allele, which make this eye brown. This eye, however, would become blue. So it can change a lot of things, and it can change a much more complex case of genetics than eyes, but that's just an easy example. So they create new combinations of genes, which is huge for evolution. And of course, sex naturally increases genetic variation, as I mentioned before, due to the fact that the combination of genes from two parents creates a new combination that will naturally make it so that there's more variation within a population for the upcoming generations. Then there is gene flow. This is the exchange of genes between populations and species. And this can be caused by the movement of individuals between separate populations, and it involves the creation of hybrid organisms. So to understand this, you may be wondering why populations has to do with it. So let's take blue jays, for example. So if you were to have a blue jay population that lived in high altitudes in the mountains, and in the mountains they evolved to have thicker beaks in order to be able to withstand the temperatures, for example. But then you also have blue jays that live on lower altitudes, but they don't need those beaks, so they therefore have thinner beaks. If these blue jay populations were to collide and then therefore reproduce, what would happen is that the alleles would be combined, and this would be a case of gene flow, because this would make it so that some of the blue jays in the mountain population would begin to have thinner beaks, and some of the blue jays in the lower altitude population will begin to have thinner beaks. Now, of course, this wouldn't be a problem for the blue jays in the lower altitudes, but for the blue jays in the mountain, this would cause a lot of problems because they needed those thick beaks. So this can have a lot of effects on the population. And it's very important to understand this. So as I stated before, there are two main mechanisms that we will be going over. So these are natural selection and sexual selection. So natural selection is when traits that enhance survival and reproduction become more common in a generation. And it has to follow three main accepted facts in science. There has to be the existence of variation in a population, which we heard before from Charles Darwin. It has to have that the different traits confer different chances of survival and reproduction, and that the traits are passed from generation to generation. Now, as we heard from before from Charles Darwin, these different traits conferring different chances of survival and reproduction creates somewhat of a competition. So this is natural selection is widely accepted as something that proves itself, essentially. And this is because it comes down a lot to logic. So let's say, going back with the blue jay population, in the case of the mountains, there are now thin-beaked blue jays and thick-beaked blue jays. The thick-beaked blue jays are adept to the cold weather. The thin-beaked blue jays are not. So which blue jays are going to be able to reproduce and thrive in this and create new generations with their alleles that have the thick-beaked genes? It will, of course, be the thick-beaked blue jays. So it essentially comes down to which gene is better, which gene is better adept to surviving in the given situation. It's very situational in this, but this is how everything happens. Then, of course, there's sexual selection. This is somewhat of a special situation. It happens when a trait that increases the mating success by increasing the attractiveness of an organism to potential mates becomes more common. This is prominently dominant among males in many animals. For example, the cardinal. You'll notice that the males are a bright red while the females are not. And of course, being a bright color gives the males a huge disadvantage for survival. But this is balanced by the high reproductive rates. The females see the red males and are therefore more attracted to them. So the fact that more males are dying is balanced out by the fact that the red males are creating a lot more offspring. So that's how sexual selection works. And like I said before, this is somewhat of a special situation. It's not as widely done as natural selection, but it is still a very significant factor. So that is the end of my evolution video. I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this series, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. But until next time, thank you again for watching. I hope you learned something.